Hello and welcome everyone. This is the third and concluding lecture on Kant, and today we are going to discuss his views on kingdom of ends and also his republican thoughts and his views on cosmopolitanism and how to attain what he calls perpetual peace among the community of the nation. So within the nation state, by following republican ideals or democratic values, one can attain peace, but how one can extend it to the international level. So that we will discuss in the first part of our lecture today, and in the second part we will discuss how Kantian philosophy shaped the metaphysical thinking and also German idealism, and what are the legitimate critique against Kantian political philosophy. So we have done two lectures already on Kant, where we have discussed his views on enlightenment and also how he connects the morality that is based on what he calls categorical imperative by differentiating it with hypothetical imperative, and then how he combines that notion of morality as the basis of duty or obligation which human being must perform, and by performing that duty and obligation human beings can realize his freedom, can attain his and her autonomy. So thereby in Kant you have a very complex or a delicate combination of freedom with morality and autonomy. So that we have already discussed. So let us start with today's lecture then. So as we have discussed before, that in Kant we have a kind of quintessential enlightenment thinker who wanted to bring about progress, development, peace, morality and also enlightenment on the basis of reason, and yet at the same time he is someone who also understands the limits of reason. So there are domain of life which we cannot know, that is the world of noumena. What we know is the world of phenomena through our sense perception, then using our own reason and rational faculty develop our knowledge or understanding on the basis of those sensation and perception. But there are world about which we do not know, we cannot know about them. So there is a kind of then paradox where the reason is the basis of all form of knowledge. It can lead to enlightenment, but also there are certain limits to reason. Then how then you combine the reason with the morality or a sense of absolute duty and obligation towards self and other? These are some of the things which we have discussed. So in Kant you have a kind of enlightenment project that was based on his invariable faith in human beings' capability as a moral and rational agent, and therefore he regarded them as capable of perfecting their own lives as well as their community. So Kant believed in human beings' capacity to reason, and through use of reason on the public matters, as a free and autonomous citizen, they can not only perfect their own life, but also can bring about enlightenment for their community and thereby progress, development, peace and prosperity. So the whole purpose of Kantian philosophy is to search for those absolute moral laws that would guide human action. And what is the framework of such moral laws is his a priori maxim that he calls categorical imperative, which we have discussed in the second lecture on Kant. So he wanted the individuals to use their own reason to guide them, but they ought to do that in a manner that they want others to follow universally and unconditionally. So there is a kind of, in categorical framework, a kind of transcendental ethics where human beings in his her own particular setup act on those laws or those moral laws which they want others to follow as well, universally and unconditionally in the same context. So, and thereby they transcend their particular context and see in themselves the presence of a universal community of free, rational and autonomous men, and that free, rational, autonomous men together constitute what he calls kingdom of ends, which we will discuss in a minute. So, we have discussed in the previous two lectures that Kant's primary objective was to understand functioning of knowledge and human reason, how it functions, what are the limits to human reason and human knowledge, and the three major critiques that he wrote: critique of pure reason, practical reason and judgment, is to analyze the realm of human understanding or human knowledge, the way it functions, and what are the limits to the knowledge and human reason. He argued in favor of reason and rationality as the basis of enlightenment, and therefore he was very critical of religious dogmas and beliefs. However, in Kant, as we have discussed, there is no rejection of faith. So, in fact, he gives reason or faith a more rational foundation rather than blind faith or blind worshipping of religious dogmas and beliefs mentioned in the scriptures or preached by the priest. So, he also argued that human freedom and autonomy are rooted in performing a duty for its own sake without any consideration of the consequences of that duty. So, human beings as a moral, rational agent will decide for themselves what action they should do, what are their obligations towards self and towards other in the community. And once they decide that on the basis of what he calls categorical imperative, they will perform that duty for its own sake. So, that is a kind of beauty in itself, and it does not require any further justification like in utilitarian philosophy or hedonist philosophy. So, Kant was thus very critical of hedonist philosophy or utilitarian philosophy, which talks about the consequences of one's action or consequences of the policy. So, the justification or assessment of a policy is based on the idea how it benefits the other, maximum good of the maximum number. So, those kind of ideas was something Kant rejected, he was very critical of. So, Kant argued that by following a priori maxim, that is categorical imperative, human beings could truly experience their freedom and autonomy. So, the realization of freedom and autonomy is like Rousseau in performing one action that human beings themselves legislate. It may also lead to a peaceful coexistence with others in society or community, and Kantian ideals of individuals and community are best illustrated in his theory of kingdom of ends. So, now we move on to this idea of kingdom of ends. So, Kant, through the formulation of the kingdom of ends, asserts the ultimate value of human life and dignity that deserve our utmost respect. So, Kant was a kind of individualist thinker in that sense, that for him the ultimate value in life is that of human life and his dignity, and it demands a kind of utmost respect from others in the society or by the community as a whole. So, there should not be interference or a kind of instrumental use of human life and her dignity. So, the kingdom of ends, through that Kant assert the ultimate value of human life and dignity, which must be respected by others in the community. And Kant explains that freedom and autonomy could be realized only in the kingdom of ends, and he explained this in the following words: so far as rational agents are all subjects to universal law, that is based on the categorical imperative, And this universal law then is something that they themselves legislate. So, are all subject to universal laws which they themselves make. They constitute a kingdom, that is a state of commonwealth, and so far as these laws bid them treat each other as ends in themselves, the kingdom so constituted is the kingdom of ends. So, that is the basis of the formation of what he calls kingdom of ends. Thereby he means that human being as a rational and moral agent will govern their life on a universal law, and this universal law is something that is not given to them by the society or by any other kind of authority. They themselves legislate through using their own reason by following this a priori maxim, what he calls categorical imperative. And then when you have a community of such men as a moral rational agent governing themselves by the universal law, then you form a commonwealth or a community where everyone will treat everyone else as an end in themselves, not as a means for something else. That community would be the kingdom of ends, where the dignity and the human life would have utmost respect and regards, and so each will respect everyone else, and thereby the dignity and the human life of each would be respected and acknowledged by everyone else, and therefore human being would be truly free and autonomous in such kingdom of ends. So, in the kingdom of ends, he also distinguishes between the members, and these members are all finite rational agents. So, there is a kind of finiteness to human rationality and human being as a rational agent. There are domains which they do not know. So, he makes this distinction between the members in the kingdom of ends as the finite rational agent and its supreme head, and this supreme head is an infinite rational agent. So, as law making agents of such kingdom, rational agents have what he called dignity, and this dignity is something which is intrinsic, unconditional and incomparable worth or worthiness in the individual. So, this is something which gives meaning to our life, and a human being as a social being, or who prefers to live in the society in association with others, constantly seek that others respect their dignity. When it is not recognized or it is used by others as an instrument for something else, then that human being feels hurt, cheated, betrayed and so on, and that leads to conflict, that leads to enviousness and even violence. So, the kingdom of ends would be a community where everyone will respect everyone else's dignity and thereby treating other as an end in themselves, not as a means for certain ends. So, in this kingdom of ends, every action is right in itself, governed by the universal law. So, everybody would perform their duty and obligation to self and others for its own sake, regardless of the consequences. So, in this kingdom of ends, every action is right in itself, or in its maxim is such that the freedom of the will of each can coexist together with the freedom of everyone in accordance with the universal law. So, there would not be any conflict of freedom and autonomy of one person versus freedom and autonomy of other person. So, everyone can live a free autonomous life without coming into conflict with similar life of others. There is a kind of mutual understanding or respect of freedom and autonomy of each by acknowledging and respecting the dignity of other person as an end in themselves, not as a means. So, Kant argues that in such kingdom, individuals would govern their lives on the principle treat humanity, whether in thine own person or in that of another, in every case as an end, never only as means. So that is how human beings would behave in the kingdom of ends. So where they will treat humanity, and this humanity applies to themselves as well. So humanity in their own person or in other person. So in every interaction with others in the society would govern by this law. That is also similar to a kind of categorical imperative, that you treat others as an end in themselves and not merely as a means. And this is not something which you use once and do not use at other occasions. It must be internally and externally consistent. That means in all the cases, in all the circumstances, you must treat others as an end in themselves. You know, many problems in the society is because, and this applies to all kinds of relationship, your friendship, your family relationship, your community ties. When you see, observe or experience people treating other people as a means for them to achieve certain other ends, then that person treated in such manner feel cheated. They feel their dignity was hurt, and that leads to the problem, that leads to conflict, that leads to enviousness in the society. And to avoid that, human being as a moral agent, as a rational agent, Kant argue, would treat every other human being as an end in themselves, thereby recognizing their dignity, and then they together can live a life of peaceful coexistence where autonomy and freedom of everyone would be respected. So this too is then based on categorical imperative. He argued that in the kingdom of ends, every man is to be respected as an absolute end in himself. So the existence of man does not require any further justification. The humanity in any person, whether the self or other, should be treated as an absolute end in themselves, not for any other further ends. And it is a crime against the dignity that belongs to him as human being to use him as mere means for some external purpose. So in the kingdom of ends, then man must not treat other men as means for certain other ends, but end in themselves, and that would constitute what he calls a community of kingdom of ends, where individual as a rational moral agent, although it's a kind of ideal imagination of such community, human beings in actual practical life do not really govern themselves according to these principles. Nonetheless, it remains the ideal and only possibility where human being can realize his true and real sense of freedom and autonomy. So Kant understood how difficult it was for human beings to live such principles of morality that tells you to treat everyone as an end in themselves. However, according to Kant, that is the only way we can create an ideal community of moral and rational agents where each would seek happiness in others and perfection in self. This is also a kind of paradox and counterintuitive thinking. So in the kingdom of ends, Kant argue that human being will not really crave for happiness. They would be guided by their duty and a sense of obligation to self and others. And in performing that duty, they make themselves worthy of happiness rather than craving for it. So in their interaction with others, they will try to seek happiness or bring happiness to others' life, and in doing so they will perfect themselves, and thereby when all the members in the community follow the same rule, that they will perfect their own duty and obligation, their own self, and seek happiness in others, the society would be a society of free and autonomous individual in the true sense of the term, and human being can realize the fullest potentiality which nature has endowed them with. that is the use of reason, rationality, to lead a life which would be peaceful, harmonious and dignified life. So, to create such a community, Kant wanted the individual to believe and act according to moral laws as if they are already part of such a community. So, it is not that Kant does not realize the practical life and imperfectibility of the practical life. That means human beings do not necessarily guide their action according to the rational principle or according to the moral laws, and yet Kant believed that you must have the absolute moral laws or perfect moral laws in the imperfect society to bring about that ideal community, and thereby bringing peace, progress, prosperity in the society or enlightened age. So, in Kant you have a kind of contemplative or ethical understanding where he wants the human subject as a moral agent to think themselves as already part of that community of kingdom of ends. So, it is not real, it is not given, and yet when individual began to think themselves as the member of that community of kingdom of ends and thereby perfecting their sense of duty and obligation, overall gradually there would be the creation of such community. So, there is the realization of imperfect world, but to make the life perfect, ideal, better than the beastly life or subhuman life of existence, you have to have life governed by certain moral laws, and when the majority and the most of the people will govern their life according to the same laws, then you have a society which would be more peaceful, more prosperous, that would recognize the dignity of each and thereby the coexistence or the peaceful harmonious coexistence of everyone. So, it is only in this community that human beings can attain what is called the highest stage of perfection. So, remember Rousseau, that human beings are free, they are inherently moral, but it is the corrupting influence of society that make them act in a certain manner. And how to avoid the corrupting influence of society or socialization was one of the chief concern for Rousseau. Similarly, in Kant you have a kind of idea that life is imperfect. Most of people live the life of immaturity condition, that means they do not use their own reason, and yet how you can bring about enlightenment, and to do that you have to have a moral laws, and only in this kind of community of kingdom of ends the highest stage of human perfection is possible, where everyone would govern themselves by the same universal laws that they want everyone else to follow unconditionally, and thereby recognizing what is the most worthy thing in human being, that is their dignity. So, the highest stage of perfection is possible in such community, and in this kingdom Kant give priority to a moral sense of duty towards self and others over the theoretical knowledge or logic. So, every human beings, and as I have discussed his views on morality, freedom and autonomy, that the rules of morality applies to human being. Why? Because human beings have the innate sense of justness or what is unjust. They may not accept it, maybe for the purpose of their personal selfish interest they tend to ignore it, but nonetheless they have the intuitive understanding of what is just, what is unjust, what is desirable, what is undesirable. They may ignore it, they may sideline it, but nonetheless they cannot remove it from their imagination, from their consciousness and from their inner self, and that is the basic premise of Kantian thinking, where he says that human beings are governed by moral laws, and this moral sense of duty and obligation should come prior to their theoretical knowledge or understanding. So, he also wants the individual to lead a life as if it was a kind of prelude to something larger, immortal life or even God. So that is the kind of the realm of metaphysics, where Kant considered this practical empirical life of individual as something which is prelude to the larger life, that is the life of immortality and even God. So he provides some kind of rational basis to religion and religious thinking or faith, not totally rejecting the use of faith or moral concern or life beyond death, so to say, in his thinking, and that leads to some kind of mysticism or mysteriousness in Kantian thinking. Now we move on to the Kantian views on republicanism and cosmopolitanism. So Kant was a republican and a great admirer of French Revolution, and he saw it as a kind of divine commandment and wanted every state or monarchies in Europe to be based on republican principles and constitution, where people themselves decide how their community should be governed and how major decisions should be taken. So he was against therefore all kind of class hierarchies and hereditary privilege that he considered the result of some unjust war in the past. Everyone must be treated equally and with dignity. The reason for such treatment or demand for such treatment is that human beings are rational or a moral agent. That has nothing to do with his class positions or any other forms of hierarchy. They must be treated equally. That is the very basis of republican ideas during the French Revolution. So in his essay, The Natural Principles of Political Order, considered in connection with the idea of universal cosmopolitan history, published in 1784, Kant argues about the need for struggle as indispensable for progress and a form of world government based on republican values. However, this struggle must be carried out within the limits of laws or within the limits of constitution. So in Kant also, as a republican, he did not reduce the individuality like Rousseau at the altar of community. So if you remember Rousseau's idea of general will, that human being must totally submit to the general will, and there is no kind of difference between individual and the general will. So these are a kind of organic connection between individual and the general will of the community. In contrast, Kant do not reduce the individual to the community and complete socialization. He argues that all progress and development happen because of individuality, enviousness and desire for power and possession, and these are something which leads to advancement in science, in technology, in industry and in overall prosperity. So this desire for power or possession led them to exert their faculties in a particular way, and according to Kant, complete socialization of man would lead to a stagnation, where human beings could lead a perfect, simple and harmonious life, but without any new development, progress and innovation. So even as a republican thinker, he do not completely reduce the individuality to the process of socialization or to the life of community. So according to Kant, as we have said, that the struggle was the part of all progress and development throughout the human history, but such a struggle must be regulated by certain laws, rules and customs. It also leads to the origin and development of civil society and eventually states, and all the capacities of man that nature has endowed him with could be fully developed in a state which is governed by a political constitution that is internally and externally perfect. So the idea is that the laws and the government must be based on the consent of the people. It has to be a kind of internally and externally consistent. That means the decisions that are taken should be in accordance with the constitution, and the constitution is something which reflects the will of the people. as a whole, not a few people or a particular section in the society such as monarchies and elite, but as a people as a whole in their collective sense reflect their will in the constitution, and government must operates in that constitution, and that constitution needs to be internally and externally perfect. He further argues that the civil constitution of every state shall be republican, and that should be the guiding force, or a kind of limits to the access of the government and its power. So, he argues that civil constitution of every state shall be republican, and war shall not be declared except by a plebiscite of all citizens. And during Kant's time, there was a kind of competitive struggle for power, for the acquisition of new territories or new colonies among the European states, and that leads to a kind of militarization where natural resources were mostly spent on preparation of war, and many welfare programs such as education, health and others were ignored. So, the whole functionaries of a state was in preparation for war, in competitive struggle for new territories, power and authority among the other states. Now, in contrast to that kind of thinking, Kant argues that how to create a society where internally a state would be republican, but also in their external relation they can have a peaceful coexistence with other states. Now, one of the major reason of such conflicts, such threat to peace was constant war, and Kant argues that the war is declared by those who have least to suffer as the consequence of it. So, it is the people, the majority of the population who suffer as the consequence of war through their lives or through their resources or property, but they have no participation while a state or its king or the ruler take a decision about war, and most of the time they declare war on the flimsy ground. So, whether to declare a war and peace, which should be preferable option, should be decided by the whole community as such. So, he wants, and this is the reflection of his faith in the republican values and democratic culture, that when it comes to declaration of war, it should be only declared when there is a plebiscite by all citizens. So, it cannot be taken by the few people who enjoy the luxury of their life and declare the war, and people suffer. So, those who suffer the consequences of war must participate in the decision about war. He also argued that the laws that governs a state internally to manage or organize political life among its members should also be the guiding principle for the international order. So, he argued that the laws that govern a state should also govern the international order if peace and harmony are to be maintained, and he further developed this idea in his conception of perpetual peace, and to which now we turn. So, in 1795 Kant wrote an essay called Eternal Peace. This may appear contradictory to you and to many scholars. Title appear contradictory as there is a constant cycle of peace and war in human existence. So, there is nothing like perpetual peace or eternal peace. There is the cycle of a period of peace followed by war, and then again peace, and then followed by war. So, the human existence or the history of human existence is replete with this cyclical nature of peace and war. and then arguing for something like eternal peace or perpetual peace was something like kind of ahistorical or a kind of counterintuitive expositions. But Kant tried to argue that how a state within its territory and also at the international level may attain peace which would be everlasting or permanent by following certain principle or moral assumption that is guided by again the categorical imperative, where the particular is not in isolation from the universal. Therefore, the transcendental ethics in Kant, if applied to individual and also to the state and international order, would create a society, create a condition of perpetual peace and eternal peace. So, if you look at the title, it may appear contradictory, and peace rarely remains everlasting. So, there is a kind of constant threat to peace, and the whole order of the state and its machinery is to maintain the peace, and yet war is something which is inevitable. So, particularly during Kant's time, nation states were constantly at war with each other, and violence was a regular part of life. Kant tries to establish a perpetual peace among the states at the international level, and he wanted the nation first to minimize and gradually entirely abolish the standing armies. So, the very legitimacy and strength of a nation state lies on the fact of its standing armies. So, to achieve peace, first Kant argues that the government should function under a civil and republican constitution, where the war is declared only through the plebiscite. So, it is the people who decide whether they should go for peace or war. Next thing that he argues is that all the state, if they want perpetual peace and eternal peace, first minimize their standing armies and eventually totally abolish them. And he argued that the standing armies of the state excites state to out-rival one another in the number of their armaments, which has no limit. So, this kind of competitive rivalry among nation states to have more and more standing army is a limitless competition. There is no end to that, and yet a state constantly tries to out-rival each other in terms of their standing army, and that is the greatest danger to peace or perpetual peace that Kant is arguing. So, he wants first that all the states should first minimize and eventually abolish their standing armies if they want to have perpetual peace among themselves within their territory and also among the other nation states at the international level. So, Kant argued that rulers rarely have resources for public education and other welfare measures, as all resources of the state are mobilized and kept for the preparation of next war. Thus, he was against all forms of violence and war, and he sees it as a violation of individual dignity and peace. Kant was equally critical of the expansionist regime of European states. So, European states expanded their territory and power beyond their territory in Asia, Africa, America or Latin America. So, Kant was equally critical of European states and their expansions in America, Africa and Asia, and the horrors they committed, the resources they extracted from these colonies, and the way they reduced the aboriginals in these lands to nothing, all at the same time when they fight for piety and republican values at home, resulted in, according to Kant, competitive militarism and ever present threat to peace among the nation states in Europe. So, he is also a critique of the colonial expansion and competitive rivalry among the European nation states to outperform other states within the Europe in conquering new territories. And the kind of horror they commit there and reduce the aboriginals of those lands to nothing. So, the territories in Asia, Africa and America was considered by the European states as open for grabbing. They can come and establish their rule, then extract resources, do all kind of horrors, all at the same time when they were fighting in their own states for greater freedom, for rights of the citizen, or pieties and the republican values. And this seems to Kant internally contradiction in the functioning of European states that leads to competitive struggle among themselves for more and more military might or standing armies, and also a kind of competitive rivalry among other states for the conquest of new territories, and that leads to a kind of threat to the possible peace or the perpetual peace that he is seeking to establish even at the international level. So, Kant however hoped, like he was arguing about enlightenment, that even in the immaturity conditions of majority of population, yet few courageous individual as a moral agent, as a rational agent will gradually take the society forward towards the enlightenment age. Similarly, among the nation states, he hoped that the states with the republican constitution and democratic values will create some kind of order at the international level, which would create the condition of perpetual peace or eternal peace. So, Kant hoped that the republican constitution and an international order based on republican and democratic values, and this must be free from slavery, bondage or exploitation of any kind. So, once you have states with a republican constitution with the values like democratic and the republican values, that is participation by the people in the decision making or in the managing the affairs of the state, when you have those states at the international level and there is a freedom from all kind of slavery, bondage and exploitation, then it would create a condition of perpetual peace among the nation states at the international level. So, he argued, and Kant was in that sense a first cosmopolitan thinker in modern times, who argued about a universal government in the form of world republic, league or federation of nation that would transcend the boundaries of the nation states. And that is part of Kantian transcendental ethics, where individual transcend their particular and consider themselves as the part of universal. Similarly, the state should operate on those laws, on those values which will create the condition of perpetual peace or eternal peace at the international level. So, that is all on Kantian views on perpetual peace, republicanism and cosmopolitanism. Now, we will look at the critical assessment of Kantian philosophy or Kantian thought. So, let us begin by understanding Kant's contribution to the history of Western philosophy, and his greatest contribution remains the three critiques that he wrote, that is an analysis of functioning and the limits of knowledge and human reason. So, Kant was first to really engage thoroughly with the idea of how human develop understanding or knowledge by the use of reason, and how it actually functions in practical life, and what are the limits of the knowledge and human reason, what are the realms, what are the areas which cannot be reached by human reason and human knowledge, and in that context what should be the basis of human actions or human behavior. So, Kant's greatest contribution remains his Critiques, which is an analysis of functioning and limits of knowledge and human reason, and he argued about the role of sensation that he derives from empiricists. So, the way we develop knowledge is through our senses, but sense alone is not and cannot be the basis of our knowledge. So, sensation is the way we understand or experience the external world, but that alone is not the sufficient ground of knowledge. So, he argued that the role of sensation is there in knowledge which leads to perception. So, first you have a kind of sensation about the external world. On the basis of that you develop certain perception which ultimately enables you to develop a definite understanding or ideas about the world or circumstances external to you on the basis of your reason and rationality. So, you cannot just experience the world and develop your knowledge automatically out of sensation. You use your reason to develop your experiences of the world through your sensory organs to have some kind of perception, some kind of definite understanding about something, and that requires use of reason and rationality. So, without reason and rationality you cannot really organize your experience or your sensory sensation of the external world. It requires some organized way of developing or looking at the world and developing your knowledge or understanding of the world. So, Kant thereby combines in a sense the empiricist and also the rationalist. So, this knowledge for Kant then is not given. So, all human beings having the sensation and experience are not equally capable of developing the correct knowledge of the world or the true knowledge of the world. It requires constant practice, meticulous practice or rigorous practice by using human reason and rationality. So, in that sense the knowledge is attainable, one can cultivate it, but human beings can also lose such capacity due to insanity or when they lack the courage to use their own reason, that means they live or prefer to live in the immaturity condition, and also when they are dependent on others for guidance. So, in such circumstances it is impossible for human being to develop their knowledge of the world. So, in other words, for Kant, then the knowledge is something which requires organization of your experience or your sensation of the external world. So, sensation helps you to understand the world, but in itself it is not sufficient. It requires a rigorous organization or meticulous organization by reason or rationality or human faculty of reason. So, Kant argues that the road to enlightenment is the unrestrained use of reason publicly in all matters, and that society would be enlightened which allows its member to use their reason publicly without any restraint. So, road to enlightenment for Kant is the unrestrained use of reason. However, such public use of reason, he also argued, must be subjected to a self-legislated moral sense of duty, obligation, which is based on a priori maxim which he calls categorical imperative. Now, throughout the 19th century, Kant's philosophy remained somewhat obscure and was subjected to harsh criticism and interpretation precisely because of its complex and almost mysterious ways of explaining and engaging with the thoughts and ideas it contains. His search for an absolute moral law and conception of duty or obligation for its own sake was contrary to the real experience or practical life. So, human beings do not do duty just for the sake of it. They have certain objectives, certain goals in the mind, and then they perform the duty to achieve those things. So, the Kantian ethics of transcendental ethics is very contrary to the human experience or the way human organize their life or govern their action or behavior according to certain moral percept. It differs from society depending upon their circumstances or their um, um, codes of behavior, depending upon their location and the needs for survival and so on. In actual society, moral laws are always then relative and not absolute, as Kant argues, and it vary from society to society depending upon their varied needs and circumstances, and human actions are driven by certain desires and goals and not necessary duty or obligation for the sake of it. Here it may be Kantian personal experience in life, as we have discussed in the first lecture, that it was a kind of series of verb: rising, preparing notes, giving lecture, having dinner and going for walk, and he followed it very meticulously. So, there is a kind of piety, there is a kind of devotion to one's duty, but that is not something that we experience in all the people all the time. Human actions are driven also by certain goals and certain objectives, which Kant argue as the hypothetical imperative may not lead to perpetual peace, whereas the categorical imperative or a definite absolute sense of moral duty and obligation would lead to perpetual peace, where individual will perform action, duty or obligation for the sake of it without any disregard to its consequences. Kant is also criticized for his abstract and obscure argument about the existence of God and immortality, even when he establishes the authority of reason. So, as we have discussed, that Kant justification for the absolute moral law is based on certain mysterious ideas or his distinction of noumena or phenomena, where there are the realms in life where human reason cannot explain certain things, such as immortality or whether God exists or not, and yet he wanted human beings to have faith. So, he provides a kind of rational basis to faith by critiquing the religious dogmas, blind faiths and worshipping, and yet the explanation that he provides is not exactly rational. So, he wants the individual to believe in something, if that leads them to perform their duties, their obligation to self and others in the society. And that is a kind of mysticism in Kant which does not really fit with his rational argument. His three critiques together provides a range of arguments that often appear paradoxical and even indefinite to many. So, if you care to read these three critiques, you may come across a range of ideas which is not necessarily consistent with first, second and third critique that he wrote. And you can arrive at very different and often contradictory interpretation of his thought, and it is in this spirit that Paul-Rie argues that in Kant's works you feel as though you were at a country fair, you can buy from him anything you want. So, freedom of the will, that is to be free, one first start thinking that he or she is free without any external constraint and limits. So, in Kant you have that freedom of the will, that is the first step towards enlightenment or towards use of reason for your own guidance or legislating your own moral laws and codes of behavior. So, in Kant you have the freedom of the will, but also you have the captivity of the will. So, this will must subject it to an a priori maxim which he calls categorical imperative. You also have idealism in Kant, but you also have refutation of idealism. You have atheism and also the good Lord. So, like a juggler out of an empty head, Kant draws out of the concept of duty a God, immortality and freedom, to the great surprise of his reader. So, in Kant complex terrain of thought, writings, you have a range of things depending upon how you interpret it. So, Kant philosophy may appear to many as merely speculative or contemplative, and particularly Hegel criticized the Kantian philosophy of human freedom and autonomy as merely empty words. So, it emphasized on the thinking about being free and autonomous, not really in the actual substantial sense. So, whether you live in the perfect or imperfect world that support freedom or not is inconsequential, immaterial for Kant. What is required is that you must think yourself as free. You must think yourself as part of universal community. So, for Hegel and many other scholars, that such kind of freedom or autonomy is hollow, merely words devoid of any substance. And drawing from Kant, Hegel formulated a dialectical process through which human knowledge progresses by interacting with an ever more complex world, and this dialectics we will discuss when we will start our lecture on Hegel. So, but much of his philosophy is inspired by Kantian thought and writing. Now, we conclude our lecture on Kant by understanding his enduring legacy. And Kant, as we have discussed, that in the history of Western philosophy after Plato and Aristotle, he altered the major premises of reason, knowledge and understanding in totality the philosophy. So, we may conclude in somewhat paradoxical way that no other philosopher has so profoundly altered the major premises of philosophy as Kant has done, and yet no other thinker remains so obscure as Kant. So, still many people do not read Kant's work. It is through the secondary writings on Kant that one develop understanding about Kant's writing and his contribution to philosophy. So, his own original writings remain somewhat impenetrable, inaccessible. So, his writings are subjected to ruthless and often contradictory interpretation. However, there is always a renewed interest in Kant's philosophy. So, in recent decades, John Rawls and many others have derived from Kant the deontological basis of their theories, and yet there are many scholars who argued about the teleological imagination and arguments in Kant. So, you have a range of or a variety of interpretation of Kant's work and his philosophical position. Kant thoroughly, however, analyzed the limits and functioning of knowledge or human reason, and that is perhaps his greatest contribution. So, reason is necessary, but it cannot lead you to all kinds of knowledge. You must have faith or subject yourself to something if it helps you to perform your moral duty and moral obligation to self and others, such as God, immortality, or life after death, or this human life as part of larger life and so on. So, his search for absolute moral laws led him in the obscure realms of justifying faith, immortality and even the existence of God as a moral precept for man to perfect their actions and behaviors towards self and others. So, Kant, as we have discussed in the first lecture, tries to unite or unify the contradictory impulses of Enlightenment tradition, and his dual foundational principle that starry heavens above and moral laws within remains a guiding light for many generations of philosophers, scholars, musicians and men of science and reason. So, there is something which is transcendental, about which we cannot know, and human reason fails to explain it fully. So, if we rely on certain faith which cannot be explained rationally, and yet human believes in the existence of such things. So, there is a starry heavens above, but moral laws within. So, the codes of behavior that should guide your action must be self-legislated. So, human beings by nature has this innate capacity to decide for themselves what is good and what is bad, what is just, what is unjust, what is desirable and what is undesirable. And it is by using the reason to perfect themselves according to those moral laws that human beings can achieve the highest perfection that is possible through living in a society which he calls kingdom of ends, by treating others as an end in themselves and not merely as the means. So, this idea of starry heavens above and moral laws within remains the guiding light for many generations of philosophers, scholars, musicians, and also men of science and reason. He was the representative figure of German idealism, and after him metaphysics began to be studied by philosophers like Schiller, Goethe, Schelling, Hegel and Schopenhauer. Beethoven, the famous musician, Spencer, Carlyle and even Nietzsche too was profoundly influenced by Kantian philosophy and transcendental ethics. So, Kant in that sense has enduring legacy and yet remains somewhat a kind of obscure thinker in the sense of his own writings. So, that is all on Kant. For the topics that we have covered today, you can refer to some of these texts like Gary Browning, A History of Modern Political Thought. You should also read Will Durant, The History of Philosophy, Paul Goyer, The Cambridge Companion to Kant and Modern Philosophy, Otfried Hoff, Immanuel Kant, and you should certainly read this particular text of Kant, Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Moral. And then you can also refer to Hans Ries, Kant Political Writing, and Roger Scruton, Kant A Very Short Introduction. So, these are some of the texts you should refer to understand more about Kant's contribution to Western philosophy, and also his views on enlightenment, morality, freedom, autonomy and also kingdom of ends and perpetual peace, cosmopolitanism and republicanism that we have covered in the 3 lectures on Kant. Do share your comments and feedbacks, we will be happy to respond. Thanks for listening. Thank you all.